Today on Off the Clock, we are going to be talking about changes that we see coming on a federal level within the federal agencies under the new administration. Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We've had a lot of fun talking about and thinking about what we think is coming on a federal level with all of the agencies, the EEOC, the NLRB, the DOL, all the acronyms, right? And I'm really excited to be talking to our listeners about that and sharing our thoughts with them.
Alphabet soup, for
yes,
sure.
Exactly.
We're kind of putting ourselves out there, right? Because there is some crystal ball magic going on with our conversation here today. So we should say that.
Correct.
For sure.
Yes.
So we may look back at this in a few years and make fun of ourselves.
Well, that's okay.
But we like to do that too, right?
I think we've been around for long enough now to feel comfortable with being wrong sometimes. So
speak for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we have a lot.
We do have a
to
lot
get through. There's so much to talk about. So let's start with the EEOC, everyone's favorite commission.
Yes. Things that I've been thinking about are how will the EEOC, the leadership of that agency, change potentially, right? With a new head honcho, right? A new administration. And what sort of things are they likely to do and how long will it take?
Sarah, for me and for people watching and listening, can you give us a primer on who leads the EEOC and how they're selected and what the process is?
Great question.
I really don't think most people know.
No, in fact, I'd never even learned it in law school, so I wouldn't presume anybody knows. So the EEOC is a federal agency, obviously, and it's led by 5 individuals. Those 5 individuals are nominated, but then have to be Senate appointed. Okay.
And those are the commissioners?
Those are the commissioners.
Okay.
Exactly. It's a commission, and those are the commissioners. But within those 5, there is one leader, okay, the head commissioner, or the chair, right?
Gosh, we should teach civics class.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Who has the ability to really drive the strategy and direction of the agencies.
Okay. I'm following you.
So, and this is an important point, the 5 members have to be Senate confirmed, but the president can decide who among those 5 gets to be the boss, right? Who gets to be the chair.
Got it.
Okay. And this is going to be important because there's different things the agency can do or not do without a vote involving all of the members, right? Some things the chair can do without having a majority support of all of the commissioners, and some things the chair cannot do. Okay. So with that understanding then, when we have a change in administration on the federal level, frankly, regardless of which way it's swinging, right? Typically, the new president would appoint a different chair that supports the president's policy. Okay?
That makes sense.
The current chair is Charlotte Burrows. So sometime, probably not too soon after January 20th, we will see that Charlotte Burrows will no longer be the chair. She'll still be on the commission, but she will no longer be the chair. And instead, a different current commissioner named Andrea Lucas will probably be who the new administration names as the chair.
So that brings up something interesting. You said the former chair will still be on the commission. Is that because the commissioners have terms?
Yes.
Specific terms? Okay.
They do have terms, and also there is a very old United States Supreme Court decision dating back to 1935.
Now you really sound like a lawyer.
I know.
instead of a civics teacher.
That held that these agency leaders can only be fired for cause.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And that decision, the original decision was in 1935, but it has been upheld periodically throughout the years, including fairly recently.
So a new president can't come in and fire all of the commissioners of the EEOC or any other similarly situated commission.
Currently, yes. Okay. Unless the current president does that with the intention of trying to get the Supreme Court to change that rule. Does that make sense? So there could be more at play here that those things are fun for you and I to talk about.
Right. Or unless they make the case
according
that
to the current, that's
right.
exactly right. According to the current law, a new administration can't just come in.
Yeah.
And these are not, our listeners will understand this concept. These are not at-will employees, right?
Yes.
Can't just come in. Okay.
They're just cause.
That's exactly right. And so as it stands, the EEOC is currently, all 5 seats are occupied. It is currently a 3-2 majority in the favor of the Democratic commissioners.
That makes sense because the former administration, President Biden's administration, has had the opportunity to appoint open positions.
Exactly. And that will be the case through 2025. The Democrats will still have the majority, a 3-2 majority, but their agenda will be set now by Andrea Lucas, who has a much different view of the world than Charlotte Burrows did. Okay?
Yes, got it.
Once those seats begin to open up, then the new administration can appoint individuals in Senate, and then it will go through the Senate confirmation process, and they have to get confirmed. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand because it does play into what is something I know they're interested in knowing, which is how soon could there be significant changes, right? And you can see they're probably predicting the place we're going to get to here is it's not, a lot of this stuff is not going to be immediate.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
So let's talk about the changes that we think the EEOC under the new administration led by Andrea Lucas, what their priorities are going to be, right?
Yes.
Once they get a majority and can do these things. And you can add to this, but I see 3 main things, Rebecca. The first one is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act regulations. The regulation, I think there's several pieces to the regulations that Andrea Lucas believed were overbroad and overly burdensome on employers. But particularly, there's a lot of concern, of course, about the inclusion of abortion in the reasons that an employee can request an accommodation under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So that's probably top of the list of things that they would be interested in changing. Those are regulations. So you know what the process is to change a regulation, right?
Yeah, you can't snap your fingers.
Correct.
And change a regulation. There is an administrative process. I did take a law school class on that, believe it or not.
Yes.
There are law school
called
classes.
Administrative law.
Administrative law, because it is so cumbersome and complicated and time consuming to pass a regulation in the first place, right? And then to either amend it or claw it back. So this is, to your point earlier, this is not something that's going to happen.
That's right.
Overnight.
So when you think through the timing, remember I just said the EEOC is not going to have a Republican majority until the end of this year. So to change those regulations, they would need to first have a majority to approved proposed regulations. Then those regulations would have to go through the public comment and notice period. And then there would be a period before they became effective. Okay, so listeners, we're talking about 2 years.
Years, not months.
Yes, years, not
that's
months.
How I think about it. Right.
That's well put.
I am not willing to get more specific now. I will be wrong, but
yes.
I'm not going to put myself out there that far.
Yeah.
So for the next 2 years at least, the regs that we talk to people a lot about and did workshops on and all of the things, last year are going to be
Effective.
the regs,
Yes.
unless.
Well, there's two things that could also happen.
What's on my
There
mind.
are some legal challenges to the regs, but those
Yeah.
really are centered around, specifically around the inclusion of abortion.
Yeah. So they're not going to throw out the entire regulation.
Exactly. So
Okay.
those lawsuits are unlikely to throw out
That's
the regulations altogether.
That's important for people to understand.
Yeah, what's happened before in situations like this is a federal agency has publicly said, yes, those regulations are published in the Federal Register and they're effective, but we're not going to enforce them.
Oh.
So that is something that Andrea Lucas could say.
Mm-hmm.
That causes a tremendous amount of confusion, of course, for courts. Right?
And therefore us and our clients.
And us and our clients.
Right.
But we, businesses would know that at least if they got a charge rather than a lawsuit, a charge with the EEOC rather than a lawsuit,
Yeah.
what the EEOC's position is going to be probably on the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. But then if it continues into court,
Yeah.
there's no predicting what a
Right.
judge would do with that.
Right.
Right?
Right. So
So-
I think that obviously individual issues with individual employees should be discussed on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely.
But in some, employers should assume that the regulations that we talked a lot about in 2024
Continue to be
are
in effect.
effective and will be for a
Correct.
significant period of time.
Okay. So then the second piece is in 2024, the agency issued a harassment guidance, an updated guidance on workplace harassment. And within that, took a fairly strong position with regard to harassment on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity,
Right.
going so far as to saying can be unlawful harassment to not let an employee use a bathroom of their choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Correct. Yep.
Andrea Lucas voted against that and was very vocal in her opposition and her opinion of that guidance. Okay. Now that's not a regulation. That's just a guidance, something that the agency published,
Right.
sent to the public.
Does not have the effect
Correct.
of law like a regulation does.
Correct.
Right. That's an
Right.
important thing for non-lawyers to understand because we say regulation versus guidance.
You got it.
Sometimes people think of those as synonyms, but
Yep.
not us. Regulations are like statutes on the book. They have the impact of law. Guidance is just expressing the agency's opinion on something.
Right.
Right. And a court does not necessarily have to agree with the agency.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, with regard to that guidance, if that also can't be changed, I mean, of course, until Andrea Lucas has a majority vote to
Okay.
formally change the guidance.
Okay.
And as we just said, that won't happen in 2025, but that could come sooner than a change to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act regs. And I could definitely see the agency publicly saying, we're not inclined to enforce this guidance as written, just so you know, employers. And because it's not a formal regulation that courts have to follow anyway, that does have a bit more import to employers, right?
Yep.
And then the third piece is the EEOC has been pushing an agenda item but hadn't taken any formal action yet regarding requiring large employers to report on wages by race, sex, ethnicity, etc. Right? Andrea Lucas can't, without a majority, make changes, but she can decide not to do something. Does that make sense?
Not put it on the agenda.
Exactly.
So to speak.
So that is something that I do think will have immediate impact,
Right.
and we will see the agency led by Andrea Lucas not pushing that agenda item forward almost immediately. So that's probably something that our listeners can sort of cross off their list of things to think about and worry about.
Excellent. That's good news.
All right.
Yes.
So you are going to talk about the Department of Labor. What's happening there?
My favorite department?
I know,
I
right?
don't know. I have a soft spot for the Department of Labor because I work with them so much. Okay. Few things to talk about with the Department of Labor. Let's start with the overtime rule because that's where they can have the biggest impact
Yes.
on day to day. employer issues and client issues. So I promise I'm not going to go through the
I was going to say,
history,
where are we
Sarah.
again on the overtime rule?
Well, are we going back to 2016?
No.
Okay, we'll not go back that far. I will only go back to 2024, I promise. But there is still a little confusion swirling around what happened towards the end of 2024. So I do want to just level set everyone what happened. Okay, so under the Biden administration, there was a new regulation rule adopted that would have the force of law, right, as we just discussed, went through a lengthy process. And it was to increase the minimum salary for exempt employees in different stages. The first increase took effect July 1st of 2024, and that raised the minimum to $43,888.
Okay.
Was the increase in July. There was another increase set to take effect January 1st of 2025, and that number annually was $58,656. And then the minimum salary was set to increase every July 1st, which made me crazy because who increases salaries in July? Anyway, it was set to increase every July 1st, every 3 years.
Every 3 years.
3 years on July 1st thereafter.
Okay.
According to economic
Based
data.
on formulas and what's
we won't
happening
bore
in the
everyone.
country.
Economic data.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So we cannot predict exactly what it will be 3 years from now. Okay. In November of last year, a court, where, Sarah?
Texas,
Texas.
who, by the way, got like a foot of snow, so.
Good. A federal court in Texas decided that the regulation was unlawful and struck it down with nationwide impact.
Yep.
That means it's as if the rule, it does not exist.
Struck it down for
according
all employers.
to the Texas court.
Yes.
That means, and I want to say this part very carefully because this is where some confusion is, even that July 1st increase from last year is no longer in effect.
But most
So-
employers did it.
They did it from an employee relations standpoint.
Well, no, they
I'm
did
not-
it because they had to in July.
In
I
July.
Mean, the
But-
requirement existed in July and then got struck down in November. Right.
So for those that implemented
Yeah.
raises and wouldn't have but for
Yeah.
that rule from an employee relations standpoint, they really need to think carefully about whether they pull back that raise or not. But right now, the minimum salary for exempt employees is $35,568 because that July 1st step up is void now. So the number reverts back to where we were, which is $35,568. The government appealed that decision as expected.
Right.
Most of the time when the government loses something, they appeal. That appeal is still pending in the Fifth Circuit. Now with the administration change coming up, right, January 20th, what do we expect to happen? Again, some crystal ballery happening with me right now. But I would anticipate that the federal government will drop its appeal. Therefore, the lower court in Texas, the district court's decision will stand. The regulation will be struck, and we'll go back to as if the regulation never happened in the first place.
Okay.
That's my prediction on the overtime regulation that went through last year. But does that mean I think the minimum salary will continue to be $35,568 for the next 4 years? Again, crystal ballery, I don't think so. I think under the first Trump administration, there was a step up to $35,000. That's when we got to the $35,000.
Yeah, they did
in the first
increase
place,
the salary.
just not as drastically. So I think we should all be prepared for it to go up again, just not as drastically. A number I have heard kicked around is around 40,000. It's never such an even number, of course, so don't hold me to that. But that's the sort of number I think employers should get comfortable with expecting when they're making plans. It would also not surprise me if the new administration adopted automatic steps. Not as drastic, but so they don't have to go through this whole
Right.
regulatory process every time they want to push a step
So
up.
if I'm a business who complied with the July 1st increase, okay, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm not quite sure what to do about that because I'm now paying more than the salary basis requires, and also I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. I think what I would be thinking, Rebecca, is I'm going to hold.
Yes.
Right? Because I agree with you. I can imagine the new administration increasing the salary basis like they did the last time. It's not a concept that they're unwilling to accept. And quite frankly, this administration is more tied to labor than they were the first time too, right? So there is an eye toward workers' interests in rights and maybe favors owed, et cetera. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit, but so I think I would just hold tight.
I would as well, because I would expect whatever the bump up is that the Trump administration
I would think it would be right around
it's going to
that.
be pretty close.
Yeah.
And when you fiddle with people's salaries too much, it's an employee relations nightmare.
Well, what
As
really
we know.
would be a nightmare would be to give the increase, go backward, give the increase or make whatever adjustment you made, right? Make
Right.
them hourly and then shift and go back to what it was. And then a year from now, find out you have to go back again.
Thanks for watching. Next week, Rebecca and Sarah will discuss what could change regarding labor rules.